I was on a weekend trip to a friend's cottage. Absent-minded and curious, I browsed through shelves in the study, scanning book spines for an interesting read to take to the firelit cottage evening. A bright yellow book stood out among the rows. I have since purchased that book myself, and it sits on my own bookshelf at home. When I first laid eyes on the volume, the word happiness popped out at me from the bright yellow background of the cover. I plucked it off the shelf and read the words on the cover. It was a book which promised me happiness in the form of an equation, a simple one-line equation at that. It inspired me to think about what it meant to be happy. I've since been reading up on the different ways that happiness is described by others and the different ways in which others strive to reach it. Through my research, I have found 4 main theories which I think interact with one another to form the basis of what it means to live a satisfying and fulfilling life. The book I found is called The Happiness Equation, and it's written by Neil Pasricha. I have linked to the book in the description below, so if you want to check it out yourself, then feel free to look there for it. But anyway, this is the book that I found that winter at my friend's cottage. And this bright blue and yellow book was the first book that tore my gaze away from pure fiction and fantasy novels to the world of self-help and nonfiction. The source of my intrigue began with the way the author had managed to sum up the entire concept of happiness and how to achieve it with a simple one-line formula. And this formula is written on the cover of the book as well. It's want nothing plus do anything equals have everything. Pasricha delves into this concept more deeply in his book, breaking it down into 9 secrets to a happier existence. But the basis for it is the simple formula that I've just mentioned. The basic idea of this formula is that if you don't have any expectations, or if you don't live life feeling like it owes you anything, then you will be satisfied with life just as it is. You will accept life, basically. So in other words, it's a form of accepting what is and doing anything in the realm of what you can control. While it proved to be an interesting approach, I still felt like something was missing or lacking in this definition or this equation. It seemed too vague to encompass what it took or all it took to be happy. When we talk about happiness, there's another thing that comes up, another kind of emotion, and that's pleasure. I thought about pleasure in relation to happiness. There are 2 kinds of pleasure. When it comes to doing anything, as is stated in the equation above, I feel that it's best when combined with the act of or engagement in active pleasure. So as I mentioned before, there are 2 types of pleasure. There's active pleasure and passive pleasure. Active pleasure refers to positive experience gained from actively engaging in an activity that one enjoys. Passive pleasure, on the other hand, refers to positive experience gained from engaging in a passive activity where the brain receives pleasure or a reward without really having to work for it. Now I'll give some examples of both. Another way you can differentiate between active pleasure and passive pleasure is how you're using your mind or your brain. Active pleasure is sort of like a mindful approach, and passive pleasure is more mindless or mind-numbing in a way. So active pleasure, some examples of active pleasure are completing a project, writing a book, building a house, programming a game, making a movie, or any activity really in which you are actively engaged in order to create something. Passive pleasure, on the other hand, like I said, is more mindless. You don't really actively use your brain as much, so watching TV without a purpose could be considered passive pleasure, where you're barely paying attention, you're not doing it with the purpose of, for example, taking the information and creating something out of it. So if you're doing that, then that's more on the side of active pleasure. But if you're just mindlessly watching or scrolling, that's more passive pleasure. Playing video games without a purpose is another one. Surfing social media, eating when you're not hungry. So basically performing any passive activity without engaging your mind simply for the sake of doing so or just wanting some pleasure for the moment. For the example that I gave of watching TV, I'd just like to elaborate on that. The reason why I put that in both categories is because a passive activity can become active depending on how it is perceived by your brain. So for example, if you're playing a video game or watching a movie, in order to create a review about it afterwards, or to just have something in mind that you're going to take that information and use it in some way or create something with it, then it becomes part of active pleasure circuitry. In a more philosophical sense, passive pleasure is associated with Epicurian hedonism. So that's where one is simply looking to seek pleasure or reward, as well as absence of pain, in the moment without having to actively work for it. But the reward gained from passive pleasure wears off very quickly. It's only felt in the moment of the activity, and there's little else to be gained from it beyond after the activity has been completed. Active pleasure differs in that one is actively working for the positive experience that you can receive from it. The brain is and has to be fully engaged in the activity to produce successful results. It cannot stay passive. This is also really well described when we think about the flow state. When we get into flow, when we're working, when we're creating something, our mind is engaged just enough to be able to be challenged and active enough to do the task, but not so much that it becomes overwhelmed. But the mind is actively engaged the perfect amount for you to be able to create whatever you're doing. Now you might be wondering, how do I distinguish between these two pleasures? One easy way to distinguish or characterize these two forms of pleasure is by how you feel during and after the activity. As I mentioned before, a person tends to feel good in the moment of engaging in a passive pleasure activity, but afterward, you may question what the result of the activity had achieved. So, in other words, what was the point of this activity? What have I gained from this activity? If the individual feels like it has been a waste of time, that's most likely passive pleasure. On the other hand, during engagement in an active pleasure activity, the mind is, again, fully engaged. So there may be a resistance or a feeling of challenge during the activity, which might not feel so great unless you're in the flow. But after the activity, the individual feels like they have accomplished something worthwhile with their time. So they've gained something from it, and they feel good after performing an active pleasure activity, like they have rightfully earned their positive feelings and their experiences, and they feel better for it. All right, so just to recap, passive pleasure is little to no engagement. So you feel good in the moment or the beginning of the activity, but it feels bad or unfulfilling after the activity has been completed. And then passive pleasure, it's full engagement, the mind's fully active, it feels challenging and maybe even difficult in the moment, but it feels good after you have completed the activity. Now, coming back to the notion of that happiness equation that I mentioned towards the beginning of this video, the reason why this formula is so effective is because it provides the idea or the mindset that one already has all the necessary things in place to be happy at any given time. So you don't need anything, right? You already have everything, so you don't want anything. And as a result, you can do anything. This also closely ties to the notion of abundance and scarcity mindset. So abundance or enoughness mindset, it's also known as gratitude mindset. It's basically focusing one's energy and thoughts on being grateful for what the person already has. So you focus on what is present in the moment. Scarcity or lacking mindset is, well, it's pretty much in the name, right? It's focusing your energy on what you don't yet have, or what you lack, or still need in order to feel good or feel happy. So you focus on what's absent in the moment. You may have heard of abundance mindset, and you may be thinking that it's always great to be in abundance mindset. And it is, but at the same time, if we already believe that we have everything, then we won't ever do anything. And I know that this is in the equation that I mentioned in the beginning of the video, but this is exactly why I think the equation is lacking something. Because if we already have everything, then what are we going to accomplish? What are we going to do with our lives? And I think this is where the balance of scarcity and abundance mindset comes into play. So while one needs to be aware of what we have, I think it can be useful at times to use scarcity mindset in order to get things done. So what I mean by this is that in order to produce change, it is good to sometimes think about what is lacking to get to a place of abundance. But on the other hand, while one needs to be aware of what is lacking or be dissatisfied with what is there currently, in order to produce change, it is dangerous to stay in the scarcity mindset for no reason. So pairing scarcity mindset with active pleasure allows one to be not only in scarcity mindset when one is doing so for the reason to accomplish something in that given moment. So the key here is in that moment. So in other words, it is best to only focus on what is absent in the moments where one can actively do something to change or improve that scarcity. So in other words, what you can control. When one is finished actively seeking to improve or create what is scarce in that moment, it is ideal to move back into this abundance mindset. An individual can repeat this cycle over as many times as needed and be in scarcity mindset in the moment of building. But the key here is that in resting state, so one is not in the process of refining or building, then they're in the state of fullness or abundance. In this way, a person can maximize happiness while still working to fix what is lacking. And that sense of accomplishment that comes from the engagement in active pleasure to engage the mind will follow. All right, so let's recap what we talked about so far. So first I mentioned that happiness equation. Then I talked about active pleasure versus passive pleasure, and I linked it to abundance versus scarcity mindset. The last and final definition of happiness that I've come across is when actions align with thoughts and words, happiness follows. I think the meaning of this has to do with one's own personal value system, if one wants to call it their moral system. It touches upon the idea that if you really truly believe something is right, living in accordance with that will provide a sense of fulfillment that you have lived in accordance with your moral obligations and values. If you think something is true, say something is true, and then also act in accordance with what you believe is true, then you are living in accordance with your own personal value system. If you compromise these values in a way that you don't actually believe is right, you're essentially compromising your self-respect, and that doesn't lead to happiness with yourself, especially if you are doing it for short-term passive pleasure, where you will have essentially betrayed your idea of truth for a fleeting moment of feeling a rush. So to summarize everything I just talked about, I think ultimately the happiness hypothesis that I have is pairing active pleasure of full mind engagement activities to improve existing abundance of worldly existences in line with your value system is, in my opinion, the greatest way to maximize the happiness equation. Alright, that's it for this video. If you enjoy the medium musings, just give this video a like down below so I know that you want to see more of them, and then I'll make more. And if you enjoy my content, then feel free to subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye for now.